Hello, and welcome to the Dissonance Podcast, where we talk about how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society. This week's episode is the first in an occasional series about coffee or chocolate. Our guest, James Hayes-Bohanan, has been doing research on the political, social, cultural, and environmental geography of coffee for over 20 years. Hello and welcome back. Today we have a coffee expert on the show. I'm going to call you a coffee expert. You're the most expert person that I know. James Hayes-Bohanan, and you might recognize the last name because we have had James's wife, the librarian. She's on the board as an advisor at Institute for Liberal Values. And so, James, I don't want to do you a disservice by under-emphasizing, but it seems you've been doing research on coffee for over 20 years, and you're a geographer by trade. And I happened to find this article on psychology in the coffee shop, and we sort of decided on this idea of having at least one podcast, maybe two, depending on how long we go today, about coffee. So I want to give you just a second to introduce yourself and your credentials before we go any further.
Thank you. I do tend to disavow the term expert because I know some experts. I call myself the coffee maven, which is kind of a rabid enthusiast. But I have picked up quite a lot. I was hired at Bridgewater in 1997 to teach in geography of Latin America and environmental geography. And within the first couple of years, those overlapped a little bit. I had a guest who went on to become a famous actual coffee expert in my classroom in 1999. And by 2006, I took my first travel course to Nicaragua, where I led 12 travel classes related to coffee. I've since led courses in Costa Rica and in Cabo Verde. And then I've been teaching all along, starting soon after that. I have taught every year a second year seminar, which is a general ed class for people of any major, called The Secret Life of Coffee. My wife, Pam, the librarian, came up with that title. And it's an exploration of coffee at a global scale and also coffee at the coffee shop scale. So this idea of the local geography of a coffee shop as a third space has been of great interest to me, and it gives me an excuse to visit coffee shops wherever I go. I consider that part of my duty to visit coffee shops.
Darn.
Tough work.
So I happened on this article. I was actually looking for research on like the history of coffee and the geography of coffee and the politics of coffee. And there's so many things. I mean, we emailed back and forth for like a month, right, about the possible topics. But I happened to find this just short little article, which we will link in the show notes. But it covers a lot. It's called The Psychology in the Coffee Shop. And he really sort of dabbles in a lot. He talks about the effects of caffeine and the explosion of coffee shops. And I don't know that those don't necessarily go together. I mean, he's talking about sort of the little social microcosm of a coffee shop and the psychology of that. And I know that that's not your specific area of research, the psychology of the coffee shop, but it's certainly part of what you have found. I mean, you even told me a couple of little stories about that. And again, you already mentioned how much fun it is for that to be part of your job, right? So he says that he mentions coffee shop culture, and I kind of like. I did some Googling. I did the Googling. What are possible definitions of coffee shop culture? What do you think? What do you think of when you hear the term coffee shop culture?
Okay. I think of the fact that coffee shops have been a gathering place for centuries, going back to Arabia. The vice governor, the governor of Mecca, 500 years ago, shut down the coffee shops because people were gathering and talking in ways that he found to be a problem. And so they're kind of similar to bars in a way. And one thing I always tell my students is that people might get together in a bar and talk about politics and complain about the government. They're not going to leave with a plan. And if people are sitting around getting more and more alert and talking, they might actually come up with a plan. They might actually make something happen. There's some claims that the Transatlantic Postal Service began in a coffee shop, that Lloyd's of London Insurance may have started in a coffee shop. There are people gather and get some things done. That's one thing. But it's not the place of employment. It's not the place of worship. It's not a political place of political representation. It has been this place where people come together. The caffeine maybe gives them both focus and a little bit of liberation. And it's a third space, that place that people go, and some people go very routinely to the same one. As I've seen, and as I send my students out, I always require my students to give a report on a coffee shop. It has to be an independent one. And there are a couple different reasons for that, but just learning about different ways of thinking about local space as a cultural geographer is part of what I'm doing there. And I ask them to make observations and to tell us what it is that makes this coffee shop successful. Because if it's open, it's been successful at least for a little while. And I first got the idea for this assignment. Can I tell you how I got this into this whole coffee shop
Yeah.
thing? So sometimes I've become a bit of a purist about the coffee itself. And sometimes I go into a shop where I know that I can find out about the whole supply chain of exactly what farm each cup of coffee in a place came from. I've been to shops like that for real coffee nerds, right? Or people who just care about real direct fair trade coffee. But then other coffee shops that aren't specialized in the beverage necessarily at all still have some reason that people keep coming. So sometimes I'll say, ask, what can you tell me about the coffee? And usually we get like a very vague answer. People seem to like it. Then it's not one of these nerd places. But then I say also, what is it that seems to be making this place function? What makes it tick? And I got the idea because I was in kind of a very mid-level, what I'd call very mid-level coffee shop. Nothing special about the coffee itself. But I was in there while waiting for Pam. Pam was at an appointment, and I was in this coffee shop just as I was starting to think about this class back in 2006. And I noticed a couple of things. One is that there were a bunch of guys sitting near me talking about local politics, stuff that only local people would have any idea what they were saying. And they were there when I got there, they were there when I left. And then there was also this steady stream of people coming in the door, walking in, getting recognized as they were walking across the floor, and having their order handed to them almost automatically, and a little chit chat. And that was a steady stream. This place had no drive-through window. And it was next door to a Dunkin' Donuts, which does have a drive-through window. So I had to think, this would be a great assignment to have students go to a place like this and see what's happening and what is it that keeps bringing people back. I later learned that place had been at that location for 40 years. So it predated the Dunkin' Donuts, and there were plenty of people keeping the Dunkin' Donuts going, but there were also plenty of people keeping this independent place going. And that was 15 years ago. I'm pretty sure it's still there, this shop. So there is a community. Even the people who were moving through on that particular morning, there was space in there that probably other days of the week or the weekend they might come back. But it was definitely connected. And so I often find there's something going on in that shop that provides a little bit of connectivity.
Yeah, I mean, this author talks about sort of this, the cafe philosopher, and the sort of the writing on the napkin, or the coffee ringed, the coffee stained, sort of manuscript and that kind. There's sort of a mystique. There's sort of a magic, I think, about these conversations. And if when you look at during election season and stuff, oftentimes the news organizations show up at a local, if not a coffee shop, sort of a breakfast and lunch place, where
Yes.
again, people are gathering. It's people who know each other. They're sitting at their favorite table, and I think that's really interesting that how many years ago did you say they were identified as a potential site of
About 500 years ago.
500 years ago.
Yes.
This idea that there might be too much sort of political conversation going on there, and the author there's a very brief description about sort of the chemical nature of coffee and caffeine and the ritual, and he talks a little bit about the addictive nature of that, the like similar to the use of drugs, this ritualistic preparation and savoring of the process of getting coffee, and we like watching that even at the cafe, right? We like to watch people prepare our coffee.
Yes, definitely. In some places that do really specialize, like Intelligentsia Cafe in Chicago, which has since been bought out by one of the big conglomerates, but it still operates as Intelligentsia. When I was there, you could pick which filter you wanted them to use. You could watch them weigh it, all of this kind of thing, and they kept that after they after they were bought out. They still maintain that at even at Starbucks, which is also mentioned in the article, of course. Starbucks, there was a special way of making coffee that was actually invented by George Howell in here in Massachusetts. He invented this new way of making coffee, and at first Starbucks was so afraid of it, the clover, that they bought the rights to the whole machine, and they were installing these $20,000 coffee machines in all select cafes. Some of the Starbucks where people would actually sit and stay, you could get a clover, and that would be one where you could see the origin, watch the process, and it was kind of an amazing thing. And then one day Starbucks woke up and said, maybe it's too slow. Because Starbucks has this tension between the ideal,
Yes.
Howard Schultz liked the idea of the cafes in Italy, but they don't have turnover. It's I think the clover went away for that reason. But it was, and so now I don't think you can find a clover machine anywhere. I don't know what happened to them. But yeah, that ritual. And as I read that in the article, I thought, well, is it a ritual, or is it just that I know this is what makes the coffee the way I want it? And that's sort of an open question, I guess. But
Yeah.
I can taste the difference. So I'm thinking I'm doing, I'm up at 4:45 to get the coffee started. Unless I forgot to roast, then I'm up at 4:15 to get the coffee going on a work day. So we can be ready to leave by 8. I have to get up at 4:45, and there's certain things I need to do. And if I don't do them, I'm going to be able to tell. But maybe that is in my head.
Well, there's a certain elitism. I mean, but there's a joy in that routine too. There's a lot going on. I mean, he's talking about caffeine is exceptionally permeable in terms of getting into the blood, the blood-brain barrier, and all that kind of stuff. But I do think that there's that anticipatory hit too, that you go through, as you're going through that ritual, the comfort, there's, the comfort of your regular coffee shop and the people that are there, the comfort of your personal routine at home, whatever that is also giving you those, little dopamine hits and stuff.
You're absolutely right, because otherwise, how could I do? If it were strictly the chemical thing, I would have one of those machines that you press the button the night before and it brews so that it's brewing at 4:45.
Right.
But I do have to be up and get myself through that first half hour without the actual coffee. So you're absolutely right. The
Yeah.
anticipation.
Yeah, we
It's
almost want
kind
to
of a
sing. I almost want to sing the ketchup song, the
yes,
anticipation. Yeah,
exactly. Um, there's a
yes.
ketchup is mentioned in the coffee song, the Frank Sinatra song. That's something we can put in the notes. A song that is something I usually start my class with is a Frank Sinatra song called. It's just called the Coffee Song, and it's kind of a play on the fact that the Brazilians produce and drink so much coffee, in that they drink an awful lot of coffee in Brazil. And he says that the coffee ends up in everything, in like even the ketchup. When their ham and eggs need savor, when their ham and eggs need flavor, coffee ketchup gives them savor or something like that.
Oh,
So there's even a little ketchup. Coffee's connected to everything. And it is true that in Brazil, and we'll come back to other things, but I do have to mention Brazil. Um, I've been to Brazil something like a dozen times, a little more. Hardly ever been on a coffee farm. I've been to one coffee research station, but I've been to Brazil for other reasons. But there's always coffee, always coffee. I've been in line waiting to buy coffee and been able to get like a little cup of free coffee that's just there while I'm standing
to
in
hold
line
you over.
to hold me over. It's everywhere.
Well, when I was this is off topic, but when I was a kid, and I don't know about when when you were growing up, but when I was a kid, my grandparents and they drank coffee all day long.
Mhm.
Um, they had coffee with dinner. They didn't have water or wine with dinner. They had coffee with dinner. And so I remember, I mean, coffee was ubiquitous. It was just everywhere all day long. You could always go to the pot and have a cup and get a cup of coffee. Always. It was
Mhm.
all day long. Um,
My mother's family was like that. My mother's mother and her aunt, who we visited a lot, drank only Maxwell House, and with a lot of cream and sugar. I think I sometimes took a little sip, but I generally didn't want it. We never had it in our house. My mother never got it if we were out, but if she was at her mother's house or her aunt's house, we had it. And I've still not found coffee that tastes the way I remember that. Because I
mhm.
do sometimes bring Maxwell House into my classroom, and by the time I bring it in, my students are horrified. They can't touch it. It's just all. It's like an oil change. But the but the Maxwell House, it's really good for it was because they were percolating it, and percolating is very good for the room. It's terrible for the coffee because it over extracts it, but it makes the room smell so
Yeah.
nice. It's the best
Yeah.
thing for the room.
And it's
Exactly.
just caught up again. I mean, this is sort of related to the coffee shop and everything, this sort of microcosm. Like, it's very caught up for me in these memories of them sitting around playing poker of an evening, just still telling stories, the in and out of people into the house, visiting, just dropping by for a cup of coffee, and again, the conversations that happened. It wasn't at a cafe, but it was in, sort of in the front room of the house. People came in, well, I guess it was the back room. They came in through the porch, just came in as far as the kitchen, having a cup of coffee, sitting down at the table for a little bit, having these, conversations about local happenings, and then, good to see you, and heading out. But coffee was central to that.
Yes, and the aroma. My father's never had a cup of coffee, but he does like the aroma. Um, and kind of looking around my building because when I do this seminar, their final project for the students usually involves a public event where they're serving lots of different coffees, and often people. I'm in a huge building, biggest building on our campus, and sometimes I'll have this event, and by the time people get to the event, they've been picking up the aroma for like a minute or two from other parts of the building. It kind of permeates, and by the time they arrive, they've had that pre-coffee dopamine that you were talking about, I guess,
Yeah.
because they arrive happy even before they get to taste it.
So the um, sort of he sort of ends, well, I don't know, it's a very short article, but he's talking about sort of this sort of like excuse for, he says, coffee provides an excuse for, and a spurs on, our need for social interaction and these sort of this small world properties, he says, where we have a bias towards seeing the world in terms of small worlds, a bias that makes the world seem more comprehensible and comfortable. And I think that's kind of what we're talking about here, is that just, that coffee, for many people, not for everyone, but for many people, is part of that. Even for your dad who doesn't drink it, it's the smell is part of it. And this idea of coffee shops or small, like around the kitchen table or whatever, sort of making the world manageable.
Yes, and exactly. I mean, I'll pick on my dad just a little bit more. My dad lives alone now, and but he has some friends who he meets occasionally, and what he'll tell me is that he meets these guys for coffee. And I know he's not having coffee, but
Right.
that's just his shorthand. And I really, when I read this article again yesterday, I actually highlighted the part you were just mentioning because I need to go. He mentions this is a 2003 student paper from the Psychologist. He mentions a 2002 paper about this whole idea of small worlds, and he posits that we might have a need to create. He puts that in create small worlds. So I need to. That's the rabbit hole I need to go down next. See about that, because it is creating that, and
Is
so the
that
drive-through misses it.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. The drive-through completely misses it. And of course, we're both college professors, and our students show up, just like with an iced coffee, that they sort of drove through and got. And it does feel a little, I don't know, a little sad to me. Just a little, just a little. And so yeah, I liked this section and this, he says, but he does talk about what you were talking about a few minutes ago. Coffee shops as meeting places foster the spread of information, and provide a riotously democratic forum, advertising everything from evening classes. So he's talking about the bulletin boards that show up, and it isn't just coffee shops. That's at libraries and other places. But yeah, in the local grocery store. So like the little grocery store in town has one of those, same kind of thing. And people just stand there and look at the
Yes.
bulletin
Yeah.
board. So he says, so coffee shops become part of the system of distributed cognition, a place that allows collective decisions and collective memory. So this place, I like that idea, the sort of distributed cognition, and this idea of, as people meet in pairs and groups, the collective experience of the community is retrieved and exchanged. The network of individuals that are influencers and that influence. So a little different than your social media influencers.
Right. And this is in that collective cognition is probably why journalists covering political campaigns have found their way to coffee shops.
Yeah, because they are getting their finger on the pulse there. Yeah, absolutely. So he does. I want to go back. We mentioned actually before we started, we want to go back to the beginning of the article, but to sort of segue into a little bit more about geopolitical aspects of coffee. But he does. He says he ends his article. In the 21st century, we might hope that the resurgence of the coffee shop will be followed by a comparable resurgence of civic values and participatory democracy. Yeah, we would hope for that.
Yes, that would be lovely. Gather around the coffee.
Yeah. So he starts this article by talking about Starbucks. So we're kind of circling around to the beginning in order to get to a whole different topic here. But he's talking about basically the sort of the explosion of the coffee shop in America in the 1990s. I don't know if that's when you would put a pin in it, but he says the global sales of coffee leapt from 30 billion to 50 billion is what he's suggesting. And then he says, and of course this article is from 2000 3, so 20 years ago. So I don't know what it is now. But he says also at the same time, we should note that the money received by growers dropped from 12 billion to 8 billion. And so I know, again, in 20 years, that has changed a lot, but hope, so
So
update us.
the numbers are really hard to pin down because we have to look at there's coffee as a commodity, coffee as a final product, but the general idea, if I were guessing right now, I'd say 100 billion to 120, something like that. It's really interesting that he cites, when he talks about the industry growing and the workers' share, the farmers' share shrinking, he cites Oxfam, which has been and continues to be one of the leaders in writing about, teaching about, and trying to do something about that particular really important aspect of coffee, and the thing that got me involved in the first place.
So what is Oxfam?
So Oxfam is a British British-based non-government organization that looks at social inequality worldwide. I think with really to do with agriculture more than other things. I think I've seen them in some other. I was aware of them before I got interested in coffee. Some other kind of human rights things that they were doing, but they continue to report on coffee continuously. The whole fair trade movement grew with the help of non-government organizations like this and certain religious organizations, Lutheran World Relief, and a few others that have really gotten into kind of direct work with growers. And it was around this time that and it's kind of it's kind of an odd coincidence, right? The industry is growing. One would think that all the money would grow, but this other thing happened at around the same time that I think is would have been even worse, I guess, if the market weren't growing. Because as the market grew, the share for growers shrank, and that's because the wholesale price of coffee really plummeted, and that had to do with Vietnam.
Yeah, so I want to talk about, so this was complete news to me. Like, I never knew that. Again, I thought it was all about Brazil, right? Like, oh, Brazilian coffee, Colombian coffee. Like, what's the, so, I didn't realize until I sort of got to know you and Pam, like the geopolitical stuff that is involved in coffee. And certainly, obviously you're very interested in the environmental stuff, and you have a lot to say about that too. But Vietnam, that would be the last place that I would have, if you had asked me to list, Vietnam would not have come into my consciousness.
Right.
So just recently you wrote a blog, again, which we'll link to, about on your environmental geography site, about Vietnam. So tell us about, how did Vietnam get involved in coffee?
Yeah. So what had happened was, in my hazy waking up early in the morning, right around the time I'm making coffee, I often hear on our local station, BBC, has a segment called on world history, witness history. And it's always an interview with somebody who was connected to some historic event. Might have been 20 years ago, might have been 100 years ago. And they do a 9-minute segment. And I heard them say coffee in Vietnam. So I'm fully awake at this point. And it was a piece of the Vietnam coffee story I did not know. And so in this blog post, I start with the witness history audio, which explains that, if we go way back, coffee was grown in Vietnam because the French wanted it there. So from the French colonization of Vietnam, a small coffee industry grew. This witness history piece is about the, I guess, 1980s or 70s, 1970s. East Germany realized that they had a real, the people of East Germany wanted their coffee and they couldn't afford it. And so they looked around like, how can we get coffee? And so this interview is with the guy who was selected by the government to lead the effort to get coffee for for East Germany. And what they came up with was another planned economy that was in the coffee belt where coffee could be grown. And so this guy made 50 trips to Vietnam in just a few years, over the space of just a few years. He brought coffee seedlings. They grew into coffee trees. He brought machinery. They created a whole industry. Now, I always say that my job is to use coffee to teach geography and geography to teach coffee. So in this story, I'm hearing numbers. And so the first thing I do when I hear numbers about places is I start to look for comparisons. So I figure out that the area that he is credited with creating a coffee industry for the purposes of supplying coffee to East Germany is about 2% of the current coffee growing area of Vietnam. It was 10,000
Wow.
hectares, which just sounds big, right? 10,000 hectares. Do you know, everybody know what that is? That's 25,000 acres. But what is that? That's like 30 square miles. That's a lot of coffee. It's plenty for Germany, but something happened after that. And what happened after that is that the coffee industry in Vietnam got even bigger. And the story I've heard, and this was just from one guy who was involved in it, told me that it makes sense. Vietnam was still sort of on the outskirts of the world community, and people in the World Bank wanting to do something to bring Vietnam into the orbit, to the community of nations better. And trade is often one lever for doing that, right? One tool for doing that is to have people trading with each other. So they being the World Bank, put money into growing the Vietnam coffee industry. Whether that's exactly what happened or not, I'm not sure, but it sure did grow, and it has been number 2 consistently for the last couple decades. It has been never number 1, but never number 3. Number 3 or 4 has usually been Colombia or maybe what would be number 3? Maybe Indonesia. There's a few other countries that would be moving around within the top 5 spaces, but 2 has been Vietnam ever since they got involved. And when I said
Wow.
it's in the coffee belt, I mean that it's in the latitudinal zone for coffee, which
Okay.
is the tropics. But in most of the coffee belt, you have to go to the right latitude and then go up
Okay.
to higher ground, at least to relatively high ground. Vietnam has the heat to make the plant grow, but it's too much and it's too wet. Almost the whole country is too wet and hot for high quality coffee. So the Vietnamese coffee is grown with a lot of chemical support,
Mhm.
a lot of pesticide use, really quite bad for the local communities it grows in, but they can grow so much of it. In Brazil, quality has never been the big thing. It's been quantity. But in Vietnam, it's been even more so. So this coffee, there is in both countries special high quality coffee, but it's a very small percentage. Both Brazil and Vietnam are known mostly for their ability to produce tons of coffee.
Quantity.
Quantity. And then we have the really weird thing is this is only possible because even the mediocre coffee companies will hire expert noses, people who are much better than I am at tasting the coffee. They have to taste it and figure out like how much of this can we put into our blend, and then buy some good coffee like from Vietnam, like from Nicaragua or Colombia to mix in with it to make
Mhm.
it what our customers expect. If you pick up mediocre coffee in the grocery store, it's like a thesaurus for nostalgia, consistency, reliability. They never make any claims that it's great. They just make it like that it tastes like you remember it. And to do that, it's a different blend every year. I mean, just like wine, this year's crop in a
Oh.
location X is not going to taste like last year's exactly. And so the blends shift a little bit to get that same flavor. And this is true whether we're at like the barely calling it coffee level or the Dunkin' Donuts level, or even something like a Starbucks level. There's a blend. Anything that's not named for a place is a blend, and every year they have to recalibrate that. And the price differential was so good with Vietnamese coffee coming in that it was worth trying to figure that out, and they could afford to blend in some higher quality, literally higher elevation coffee from someplace else to make that work. The reason this became a tragedy is that the world price went from the neighborhood of $1 a pound at the dock to the neighborhood of 20 to 40 cents a pound at the dock. And these days it's somewhere above $2. And I mention at the dock because that really highlighted the additional problem. There's the problem of what is the export price, and then what's the distance between the financial distance between the export and the grower. And that's where these middlemen come in. In Latin America, we call them coyotes. The coyote is the one who buys at the edge of the farm and takes it to a small warehouse, and then they take it to a bigger warehouse, and then they take it to somebody who can actually mill it and export it. And it's probably going to go through 3 or 4 hands, each paying what they can get away with. And at the beginning of that chain are people who don't know the numbers anywhere along that chain. As late as 2008, Pam and Harvey and I visited some farmers in Guatemala. An American sociologist had invited us to come meet these farmers because she couldn't figure out she knew they needed some help. She knew there needed to be something about fair trade. She did not know how to help them. And every time she Googled it, she kept finding my website. So she eventually contacted me. And we went and met these farmers. And, I knew that these were grown-ups and that we were there for grown-up conversation, but I still, after, kind of getting introduced and everything, we finally sat down for the real conversation. I'm like, oh my God, she's going to ask. She started with, so what's a cup of coffee cost at a Starbucks in New York City?
Right.
And then how many beans is that? How many pounds is that? Blah, blah, blah. You work that back to what that would equate to at the farm gate. And we came up with $80 to $100 from a pound of coffee is what was being generated. And then we found out what they were getting, which was 5 cents a pound. And that was a tough conversation.
Mm-hmm.
But I was the first person who had ever told them any of this. And they didn't know what happened to it. As far as they were concerned, it was like they sold avocados too. Avocados and coffee often grow in the same spot nicely.
Really?
They grew avocados, and somebody would come buy the avocados. They go away, and they knew, well, somebody eats that, right? There's not a lot you have to think about. But they had no idea what happened to the coffee. This fruit left their farm. It was 2 brothers. They knew the fruit was leaving the farm. They were getting 5 cents a pound for it. We had to do a lot of math because it's in kilos and quetzals and everything. But I like math. Every fair trade coffee farmer I've met, by the way, is pretty good at math. The people who actually do get into this and understand the market and make it work for themselves, they can convert currency and pounds and tons and wet and dry and all of that in their head. It's pretty remarkable. The information is the real benefit of the whole fair trade movement.
Because of all these middlemen, and it's just hard to trace.
And so the more you know, the more you can say, even if you do still have to deal with a middleman, a coyote. Coyote, by the way, is a word I never say out loud in Latin America because I'm always interested in meeting them, but I don't want them to hear me say that. Even if you're going to still have to deal with them, it would be helpful to know the rest of the value chain. And ideally, farmers can build their own separate value chains, and with the help of NGOs, some of the NGOs like the Lutheran Church Group and others that I mentioned.
So I do want, if I don't want to totally leave Vietnam. I don't want to leave Vietnam entirely behind us, but I am interested. When we first started talking about having the podcast, I'm really interested in this. This fair trade, this small farm. I think there's a ruling in the UK that they're going to, they're trying to, keeps getting delayed about this their uh, regulations about what's a small farmer, and there seems to be a lot of contention. It's like, is the small farm a good thing? Is it a bad thing? These NGOs. I'm a little like, as a coffee consumer, why should I care about this? Why should I? I that's the main thing, is like, I kind of was getting the idea I should care about this, but I don't know how to, because I can't figure this out.
Yes. There's a lot of opacity in this whole market. Even 40 years after fair trade started, 25 or more years after it started in the US, it's still really hard to figure out. And one thing that happened is that the fair trade model was developed, and then it got trademarked. And so fair trade, as it's used in the United States, has become a label that people can get who would really not be part of the original idea of fair trade, which was for small farmers. And I guess, I mean, I have a friend who has a relatively large farm in Nicaragua, and when they first tried to broaden the brand to include larger farmers, he was the first one they came to, he and his wife, and they said, no, we're treating our workers fairly. We don't need this certification, and it would be dishonest to give us this certification, because consumers who do care about fair trade are thinking small farmers. Now, talking to a fair trade leader back here in Massachusetts, that guy who first showed up in my classroom in '99, I mentioned this to him, and he said, "Oh, your friend should break up his farm and give it to small farmers, and then they could get fair trade status." And I'm just thinking, that's not going to work. That's just not. That's not. There is such a thing as an economy of scale in that particular. Whether it's correct or not, this is the breakup of the consolidation of that land 150 years ago is not something that could really readily be that's not a bell that we can unring, I don't think. Some would say we should, that we should just have real land reform, break up all the large farms. He's saying that because in part of the response to the crisis in Nicaragua in 2001 was the breakup of some large farms that failed catastrophically, in a financial sense, did end up reverting to small farm owners, and that has worked. So there's precedent for it, but making that the only way to go, I think, would be really counterproductive. So there's an emphasis in the UK and by those in the US who don't use the trademark fair trade anymore to work with small farmers, and then they just have to tell us their story. And I have some friends who, importers who've never used the fair trade label. They do their own direct trade, and they're comfortable telling their customers the story. This is how we got the coffee. These are the people who grow it. But that's a lot of work
Right.
even for a consumer. I mean, what would be nice is if we didn't have to rely on voting with our pocketbook, and if our actual votes would create trade rules that would protect growers, but that would require a certain minimum treatment of workers, but that seems to not be happening. This friend, by the way, who has the larger farm in Nicaragua, he and his wife have people who've been working on their farm for 3 generations. Some of them seasonally and some of them year round. So they're doing something humane there, I think. And I've been free to walk around on that property.
There are different ways to think about humanity, right?
Right.
About being fair and being humane, and there's more than one way.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I guess 2 things. One question would be, are any of the farms in Vietnam, would any of them be small farm? And then my another question that I had, this kind of gets back to what you were saying, like when you go into a coffee shop, tell me about your coffee. So, so those are like, that's the story that you're talking about now. Like some coffee shops, do talk about this, and sometimes when you buy a bag of coffee, it'll say like, here's our story or whatever. I don't know whether to believe that or not.
It's tough. To Vietnam, I mean, honestly, I'm not aware of any fair trade coffee from Vietnam. I am aware of some high quality coffee, and there's a bit of correlation between better quality and better treatment of the workers.
Is small farm and fair trade, are those two terms, sort of interchangeable?
No,
Okay.
unfortunately, no, because so fair trade means a small farm that is part of a local cooperative
Okay.
that has met certain conditions for the treatment of its members and the participation of its members. And in return, the buyer provides a guaranteed payment to them and a number of other supports. But with the price there, the price that normally fluctuates, like I said, it tends to be over $2 lately, but it could go down to $1 tomorrow. The fair trade floor is about $1.50. So even if the world price goes down, those buyers are still committing to paying a certain price, and they do that with cooperatives of small farmers. And so the reason the small farm question comes up is that there are buyers who would it's more convenient if the buyer can just deal with larger entities. So they would like to buy from a large estate and say, it's the same. They're treating their workers well. We're going to call it the same thing. And that's better than maybe not doing anything. But, I've been on a couple of different farms that grow for that big company we've been mentioning. And the first time I was on one of those farms, no, the second time I was on one of those farms, I was with a student who was the manager at Starbucks, and somebody I've known now for many, many years. She was just disgusted because what she was seeing and what she could compare it to, both in terms of the number of dollars she knew came through her cash register every day, and the art on the wall, the photographs on the wall of small farmers, happy farmers.
Yeah.
It just it got her out of that job. Seeing that reality. There's so I don't know if I've answered that, but the fair trade is a whole thing.
Yeah. Well, so I guess we should be forgiven for being a little confused, I guess, sometimes by these stories.
There is no I wish I had, when I first started doing this, there was kind of a sweet spot in the early aughts. So I could say, look for that fair trade label.
Right.
And then it got co-opted. So that's better than not having it. And of course, the way spoiler alert for my coffee seminar, the final exam says, what would you like to know? Now, think about something else you consume. What questions do you have about that now? There's no fair trade corn.
Right.
There's no fair trade cell phones, So it's just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah. So you started to answer about Vietnam. So there's no, as far as you know, no like sort of fair trade small growers in Vietnam, but there are
some boutique, there are some specialty growers, but there is a little bit of there was some fair trade. I'm just remembering, one of my friends actually was selling, one of my friends who only buys fair trade was buying from Vietnam for a while, but his company's not doing that anymore. So I think it was very tenuous. So there's a little bit. Certainly the vast majority of that, it's like 15-20% of the world market is from Vietnam now. And the vast majority of that is not organic, not fair trade. Fair trade does not require organic certification.
Mm.
but it does require at least some minimal environmental standards be met.
Is that more about the workers than
Right,
the
to
coffee?
protect the workers, right? So we have like two kind of broad categories of certifications. The social certifications are specifically about the treatment of workers, and the environmental certifications are specifically about the soil and the water. Each requires something of the other, so you're not going to get like bird-friendly Smithsonian coffee with with enslaved people growing it, right?
Right.
But in the opposite is true. You're not going to get fair trade coffee that's grown with a cocktail of pesticides. But so if I can't find any other label, I will take organic over not organic, because then at least the workers are not being poisoned while they grow it. That's something.
Yes.
Uh,
So I'm springing this on you, but I did find a lot of articles with taste testers, and you mentioned the taste testing. So
yes.
I'm gonna sort of. So and you said, like, oh, you'd have taste. They might have tasters and say, oh, we need to do a little bit more of this and a little bit less of that. And I never knew about this sort of like, this idea of, like wine being different. That makes
Yes.
sense that it would be different. The not just what you put on the crop, but maybe, like you said, how much water that year, how much, that kind of stuff. And then, um, are there different kinds of coffee plants? Like there are different kinds of grapes. And then, I'm thinking like there are coffee places that I went to a local coffee shop not that long ago, this past week, and I was like, I don't really like their coffee and I don't know why. Like people rave about it, they think it's great, but there was like a little taste, and sort of like you about your morning routine, it's like, am I really tasting something different? Like, can we really, if I'm not trained as a like aficionado, can I really taste the difference? So I'm kind of wondering about, the kind of beans that are grown, are those really different, or is it more environmental, geographical,
Wow, you wouldn't believe how many hours would take me to answer this question, but I'll give you a couple. I'll work backwards and tell you a couple of highlights. One is there are about 50 steps to growing coffee, to getting coffee to your cup, and choices are made at every step: where to plant, what to plant, how to prune it, how to shade it, all the way up to how do you shell it, how long do you dry it, all these steps, all the way down to what do you pour it into. Like we could do all that right and then pour it into a styrofoam cup. Might as well just get Dunkin', right? And so there's the care of the coffee, and I spend at least a whole class with my students explaining how we care for the coffee, because if the farmer did enough to provide us with good coffee, we should respect that. And when I first got involved in this, I had no idea about any of it. I actually sought out a coffee class and went to New York City, to one of the big Italian companies, um, had an education center for its customers, and I went there and learned kind of the do's and don'ts of coffee preparation. And that really, and even though I won't usually drink that company's coffee anymore, it taught me a lot. Um, so there's how you care for it, and even if you don't know anything about the gourmet levels or anything, you could find that maybe they just didn't change maybe they haven't changed the filter on their plumbing, or maybe they're serving at the wrong temperature, or they're leaving it on the burner too long, or there's lots of things they could do wrong at the last couple steps. Um, as far as the varieties, there are 70% of the world's coffee is Arabica. That's because Linnaeus thought it came from Arabia. It actually should be called Ethiopica, but that ship sailed before Linnaeus found out. There's actually in Kew Gardens in London, they have his work, his notebook, where he has Cafea written at the top and Arabica written at the bottom. His mistake. It should be called Ethiopia. That's 70%. In one of the good news pieces is the better coffee is the more common coffee. 70% of the coffee is Arabica. 30% almost is Robusta. Those are kind of like different species, but Robusta is a variety of Canephora, so they're not apples to apples, as it were, but Coffea arabica and Coffea canephora robusta. That's the 30%. And then there's Liberica and Conilon, which I thought Conilon was a myth until I saw Conilon plantation in the Amazon. That's basically instant coffee is what you can do with Conilon, or like the flavoring in coffee ice cream or something, where it's going to be like overwhelmed with cream and sugar. But that's only 1% or so. Liberica is this huge tree from Liberia, from West Africa. The Robusta is also from West Africa. There are about 25 species of the Coffea genus. 4 of them are grown commercially. I did 4 off camera. 4 of them are grown commercially. But almost 70-30 is Arabica, with Arabica Robusta. Within that, there are many varietals, and this is where the wine comparison. So most wine, I think there are a couple species of wine grape, but when we hear things like Chardonnay and Merlot and Malbec and things like that, those are varietals. Those are like the breed of a dog, a subspecies, and there are many of those for coffee, including some fairly new ones get developed all the time. If we want to talk about climate change later, we can talk about how they go into that. And I've been lucky enough to visit some of the labs where those are being tested, but they're in Central America. They're really working on that, those varietals. So the varietals can make a difference. But again, the growing makes a huge difference. And this is where the tasters come in. It used to be the tasters were in London or New Orleans or New York or Zurich only.
Wow.
The buyers had tasters, and they tell you what your coffee is worth when you got it to them. The first place in the world where growers owned their own tasting lab was in Matagalpa, Nicaragua, at Sol Cafe, which I was lucky enough to visit. I've taken a lot of students there. Sol Cafe is the very first one that was set up where the growers could do their own tasting and get the training, so that there are peers. And so if you go to a coffee company early in the morning, maybe it's only once a week, but maybe every day if it's a big company. I've seen this, you go in and you see the tasters for that company doing some comparisons. So they sit around a table, literally a round table with a wheel, and they're spinning it to get comparable cups. There's a ritual I've seen in a bunch of
Oh, a
different.
ritual. We're back to a
There
ritual.
is a ritual of the tasting, and the way they do it. Some of the professional tasters make a big show of it, the way they slurp the coffee, things like that. But there's also a scorecard, and the professional tasters meet in a given company. They might meet every morning to compare notes, so that we're gonna give this the same number, because it doesn't seem plausible that 2 people could come up with the same score.
It
But they
doesn't.
do it with wine. It's a whole thing. It's a whole profession, right? So that finally found its way to the growing communities, starting with Soul Cafe, with a guy named Paul Katzif from San Francisco, who happened to be there the first time I showed up. Never saw him again, but he happened to be there the day that I arrived, my very first trip in 2006. That tasting is it's almost like a priesthood, because these people are now, they're responsible for what their community is sending out. So when an individual farmer comes to them, they can say, this is moldy. They don't have to taste to tell them that, but they can say there's something really wrong with this, and maybe send somebody out to the farm to help. Or they can say this is really good, and if you did something a little different, more banana leaf or something on the ground, maybe you get another point out of it next year. So they're in communication, and they're also in communication with the buyer. And coffee, for lots of complicated reasons, most coffee moves in 37,000 pound batches.
Okay.
So if I say this batch is an 82, I'm saying that 37,000 pounds is 82, and you're agreeing to this price. it better match that. And I might even send a DHL. I might send you a pound ahead of time, and you can taste it yourself. But I am still representing. Um, so the people who do that at either end, but I think especially at the grower end, they don't eat hot pepper, they don't smoke cigarettes, they don't wear perfume, they don't drink liquor, you know, especially on the days that they're tasting. I mean, they're tasting 5 days a week, so they that's why I think of it as it's like a priesthood. They just have to keep that palate alert, because it's because they do not want, if the 37,000 pounds ends up on the dock and gets rejected, Duncan will buy it. Somebody will buy it, but they won't get the price that was agreed to, and it would be a real shame, and it would make a hard time the next time. So Soul Cafe has never sent out a batch that didn't match its score. But, every day they make sure of that.
Yeah, yeah. So it is possible then for us as consumers to notice a difference. Like I go to, so whatever that coffee shop buys or uses or whatever, I'm not making it up. I can taste it to
Correct.
taste the difference.
Correct.
So is climate change affecting the taste of the coffee? I mean, I'm sure it's affecting the production.
Yes. So I think a little, like it's something like 1 degree. I'd hate to put any numbers to it, but a moderate amount of climate change would change the flavor. A little bit more. And by climate change, I mean both temperature and the timing of precipitation. This is the thing that my friends worry about more than the temperature, is the timing of the precipitation. A moderate disruption could change the quantity. So first is the quality might be affected, and then the quantity, and then you might just not be able to grow at all. Or I was going at around 2010, more or less, through Central America. There was this wave of a mold that was moving through, and climate change made the trees much more susceptible to this. And I had friends who lost 90% of their crop, and had to replant, and you don't get anything for the first 4 years after you do that.
Oh, 4 years.
Yes. So that was a huge. So they did lose the crop completely because of this disease that was related to climate change. But you can also just end up in a zone that's no longer supporting the coffee. And if you're already growing coffee at the top of a mountain, I mean, in general, you could maybe move up. But if you're already growing at the top, there is no up there.
Yeah, so back to Vietnam, right, which has a limited amount of high elevation land available to grow it.
Right.
And
so they're growing a lower quality and just accepting that they're never going to get the $2 a pound price. They're just going to sell more pounds.
Right. So to kind of circle back around to where we started. So we have coffee shops, this like small, these sort of like, small little places, and this idea of small farmers, however realistic that is, in terms of fair trade, small farmers, idealistic, maybe I should say, idealistic that is. Why? I mean, we should obviously, there's a lot of arguments for why we should care about, international politics, fair trade, and, just sort of like going into a country and starting an entirely new, for selfish reasons, I guess. And so, not that no one benefited from it, but sort of changing the agriculture in a country, concerns about, global warming and that kind of stuff. How big is the coffee market? Why should we care about the politics, about the global nature in terms of geography and climate change? Why should we care right now about this?
Wow. Well, I mean, there are millions of people who depend on it for their livelihood. Again, one of those things is kind of hard to measure, like the number of farmers, and then the farm markets, the people who sell things to the farmers, the families that are dependent. There are about 50 countries that produce significant amounts of coffee around the world. And in some of them, it remains the employer of a big percentage of the population. So how those people are compensated and treated really does make a difference. And if they're treated fairly, in financial terms, if they have an ongoing relationship with a buyer who treats them fairly, they could even move into other ways of making a living. So a lot of the farm families I've been involved with have the kids come back and help on the farm, but they also can supplement the family income because they were able to get an education. The only small town with a high school in Nicaragua is the little village of La Corona, and that's mainly because of the Fair Trade Coffee Cooperative in that community, and also in part from one of our alums who contributed significantly to the schools there and helped move them into having a high school. The schooling is really important, and when the fair trade movement is usually concerned not only with the actual amount of money that's moving into the community, but also some things that can be done cooperatively in terms of health centers and education centers. And it makes a huge difference. Now, even the countries that are producing a lot, like Brazil and Colombia, I mean, there are a lot of people in those countries that never touch a coffee farm, right? Those countries are both really diversified now, but there are some sections in which this is the major industry, and it does make a
So
difference.
are some of these places one catastrophe away from, sort of a collapse that could affect the coffee industry? Like how close are we, in terms of, climate change and, like you said, the elevations and, I think about, I mean, I've definitely heard about the impending doom of the banana industry, for example,
Mm-hmm.
like where are we in coffee,
Wow, that's a really good. The jury is maybe out. This group, I don't know if we'd have time to get to it today, but the Tropical Agricultural Research Center in Costa Rica, that's called Katie, has every varietal of coffee known, like thousands of different coffees, and they're also hybridizing some of them, and they're testing them to see which coffee. It's kind of easy to grow a coffee that can stand climate change, but can you
okay.
grow it and earn enough from it to make it worthwhile? Will it have the flavor that would make it worthwhile? So Katie develops these hybrids, or they test these different varietals against climate stresses, and then they send them out to farms for to cultivate them in real world conditions and then do the tasting. So this is research that's been going on for 10 or 15 years, and some of my friends have those like labeled varietals from Katie where they're growing them, testing them, and these are in the hands of some of the best growers. Yeah, how does that translate to the big farms? I don't know.
Yeah.
Um, but it's getting people's attention. People
Yes.
didn't think it mattered, climate change. Well, it might not matter, but what if I can't get my coffee?
Well, that's what I was going to say. So
Yeah,
like as we go to our, as we make a decision about whether to drive through somewhere or go into a local coffee shop and maybe experience some of the, the ambiance and the social connections that are there, and look around, not just for a picture of a farmer, but, for information about coffee. I mean, I feel like we just scratched the surface and sort of set the stage for deeper conversations about any one of these things. That sort of, this was the big picture, this was the
sure.
introductory lecture, and then sort of like picking, it's like, well, what should I look for in a coffee shop, and how, or coffee at the, even as the grocery store or online or whatever. These are all like, I think there's certainly, your father is the exception, but I think that vast numbers of people are are touched by coffee, even if, like your dad, he doesn't drink coffee. It's it's ubiquitous,
Yes.
and it's going to touch all of us. I think I don't know. I mean, the little bit that I was reading, I think it's a little bit of a what do I say? Like I can draw an analogy between, between coffee and other, um, I don't know, other difficulties, other socio-political, environmental, geographical conundrums that we have in society. These, the sort of the strength of weak ties, which that article mentions. It's the little the through line. We do have this through line that you can kind of 7 degrees to coffee.
Yes.
6 degrees to coffee, or whatever it is, Kevin Bacon.
Right? The
Yeah.
Kevin Bacon. Yeah,
Yeah.
we're very much connected to the world through coffee.
Yes. Yeah, as you see other really interesting things, and certainly, we invite people to comment, ask questions. They can't on the I don't think there's a way to comment except on the YouTube version, but the YouTube version is available, and people can comment and ask questions. And certainly, I'm going to be thinking about this for a while, and I hope that we can continue this.
Well, thank you very much. I always like to talk about coffee with somebody who's curious. So I look forward to any questions. And that's where I start learning things, is by the questions people ask me that I never thought about before. So,
Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.